putting artificial intelligence to work. Fatima Tambajang, head of developers, startups, and VC ecosystem for Africa and Middle East at NVIDIA. Mark Straub, CEO of Smile ID. Joris Cyizere, strategy lead at C4I Rwanda. Moderated by Lexi Novitske, general partner at Norrsken 22.
All right, guys, it's great to have you up here. As you know, at Norrsken 22, we're investing in growth stage companies across the continent, Series A through C. And one space and trend that we're really watching is AI and how that's playing a role in not only driving efficiency within the businesses that we're investing in, but also the business models themselves. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to my panelists to please give an introduction of themselves, their company, and how AI is playing a role in your business.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. First of all, well done to the Norrsken team. Super excited to be here and to engage with the ecosystem. My name is Fatima Tambajang, and I take care of Africa and Middle East for NVIDIA. So I look after our developer programs, startups, and VCs. NVIDIA has been around since 1993, currently the 7th largest company in the world. 94% of GPUs that AI infrastructure is built on NVIDIA. This time last year, ChatGPT happened and it rocked everybody's world, and it catapulted our company into $1 trillion company. How AI is affecting our world, it's just proof of concept to the market. We've been in this space since 2012.
Great. Thanks. I'm Mark. I'm the CEO and founder of Smile ID. Smile ID provides digital identity verification and KYC services across the African continent and markets linked to Africa. And we started about 6.5 years ago. And I think the connection really for us is that we heavily use computer vision. So everything from face recognition, document recognition, authentication, and anti-spoof and anti-fraud services.
Okay, great.
Thank you. First of all, great to be here as well, and congratulations to the Norrsken team for a fantastic event. My name is Joris Cyizere, and I lead strategy at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution here in Rwanda. And we are a partnership between the government of Rwanda and the World Economic Forum, so we belong to a global network of C4IR centers. And what we're doing in Rwanda specifically is advise governments on matters around AI, around artificial intelligence, and that includes both helping identify the biggest challenges from a policy governance perspective and advising on specific policy interventions around that, but then also looking beyond that to say, or to figure out what the economic value, the economic potential is, and helping the government figure out ways to unlock some of that value. Great to be on the panel today.
Okay, amazing. So AI is obviously developing at breakneck speed. If we look at Moore's Law, where computer ability really doubles every 2 years. I think in AI, that's something like 3 months. So there's obviously this massive development, but my question to you, and maybe Fatima, you can start with this, can it be productized? And can it solve some of these major problems that we're seeing across the continent, or is that just too complex for where AI is now?
Yeah, sure. Just curious, by show of hands, how many people have heard of InstaDeep? So not bad, but it looks like about 10-15% of the room. So InstaDeep this year became the largest acquired startup on the continent. It was acquired for $700 million. The average fintech unicorn that's come out that's been acquired is between 200 and 300 million. It was a startup that was started in Tunisia in 2014 with $2,000. They joined NVIDIA's ecosystem in 2016. And now they do everything from autonomous driving, biomedical, and they're actually setting up a R&D center in Rwanda. So that's just an example of how AI is being productized.
Super interesting. Any other input from you guys?
Yeah, I mean, we see both the perils or the challenges that consumers and businesses face in trying to onboard their customers on a daily basis through mobile phones, through browsers. And we see that not only can potentially AI be used to help us ascertain whether somebody is a real person, but it might also help us in handling the kinds of support questions and support issues that come up on a frequent basis. As a small company trying to serve hundreds of customers in a very technical problem, being able to build intelligence around the common pitfalls, whether it's messaging to a consumer or technical support and debugging for a business. Those tools are potentially very powerful. And it's ironic, but we actually have our entire company here right now at an offsite, and I just came from an hour panel, or I should say an hour discussion where we were talking exactly about how to use these tools internally.
Yeah, super interesting. Please jump in if you have any more insight, but I wanted to go ahead and jump on to the next question, which was maybe first directed at you, Mark, and related to building a company around machine vision, which is certainly this very deep tech problem. And in an industry that hasn't been built out yet on the African continent, except for some few examples, how are you managing that talent gap and maybe kind of filling it in? Talent gap, but maybe also other infrastructure gaps like data or what the availability is to really leverage off of that model.
Yeah, what's interesting, so these tools, which are globally available, whether it's the large language models or open source computer vision models, obviously these things are increasingly open sourced, or some version of them is open sourced. The challenge is then applying it to relevant data for the specific use case that you're trying to handle. And a great example of this, we were just looking at a bunch of rejected onboarding events from users, and we saw that the prompt to the user had been, take a picture of the front of your passport. And we had all of these photos of the front of a cover of a passport. Yeah. And this was thousands of people who had tried to sign up for bank accounts and were rejected. And it matters, like where you place a word in a sentence or what language you're using can have a huge difference. Do you give people a prompt with an image or not? But beyond just kind of UX questions, there's also a question of, once you start getting a bunch of data, is that data labeled? And labeled in a way that you can then take those open source models and actually use them? Because if you don't have that localized understanding, localized labeling, then you can't just sort of throw these tools at it. It doesn't work. So I think we now increasingly at Smile ID have data at scale, but we have to go and annotate that data and make it useful for AI models. And there is a lot of work, especially cross-functional work, to have the people who are working on the data explain to the engineers like the nuances, the nuances of a South African green book, the nuances of an Egyptian ID. These nuances matter a lot when you're trying to then solve problems with AI.
And ultimately, it does matter that is localized and that communication is happening and there's people on the ground that understand those local...
Yeah, I think it would be very hard. The conversation we just had, at the hotel up the street, which brought together people from 10 different countries and from different skill sets across the company, it would have been very hard to have that conversation someplace else. I guess we could have done it in San Francisco, but the fact is, being able to bring together people here who have context and understanding from having looked at IDs from all these different markets, and also some local understanding. We had a trivia thing like, does the Nigerian national ID, does it come in a slip or a card? And there's very specific people on our team who got those trivia questions right. They can understand it. And the engineers wouldn't necessarily, some of our engineers, let's say from North America, didn't have that same context. So it was really important to put those people together.
Interesting. So Joris, maybe I'll first direct this one at you, but also leave it open to the other panelists. So governments around the world, China has been notorious for really promoting AI in the private sector and pushing a lot of data for these AI companies to use. In Europe, there's certainly been some very thought out regulation on consent layers and confidentiality. We have a lot of government officials and some regulators in the room. So what markets would you turn to as success stories of places to watch that you would like African governments to emulate?
That's a very good question. I think there's the clear market leaders when it comes to sort of like AI innovation and breakthroughs in AI and so on. That folks can look to. So I'm not going to call out specific names, but maybe what I can say is what I think is that there's a lot of potential for AI to address some of our most basic problems in Africa, whether it's access to healthcare, access to education, improving yields in agriculture, and so on. And there's actually a few areas also where the continent has some unique, I think, leadership position for the rest of the world, whether it's about the fact that we have the youngest talent in the globally, whether it's the fact that we have an incredibly diverse genetic compositions across the continent, biodiversity, and so on. So there's a few areas where, where it's about green sources of energy, for example. Could we be the continent that powers AI for the rest of the world? So I think there's very many areas where AI can drive real value to address our basic problems, and some areas where we can have a unique leadership position for the world. So I think the question then becomes, regardless of which model you look at, you need to make sure that there's, first of all, the political will for these different countries to realize this and try to put some proactive ways to attract some of the value. And that includes, laying in place the right policy foundations, investing in education, infrastructure, and so on. But also includes these policymakers educating themselves about what is it can AI do, what are the risks, and how do you go about that. I also think that hopefully more African governments can take look at this whole element of regulating AI and take an innovative way around that. It's changing on a very high pace, as we were just talking about. And so, how are you going to regulate something that might change tomorrow? So that means that governments must be able to look at innovative ways around regulation. And I think governments also should realize the role they have beyond being a policymaker or being a regulator. Is there some interventions they can make around de-risking investments, for example, into the continent? Rwanda has set in place Rwanda Innovation Fund, which that's exactly what it's supposed to do, match funds that are coming into Rwanda, into African companies. There's a big role that the government can play around opening up markets. So again, if you look at the healthcare sector, for example, there's huge public health involvement there. Same is true for agriculture, education, and so on. And so how can government use sort of like their access to all these different opportunities to open up opportunities for startups? So I think it's really around those three. Governments have to have the political will, innovate from a regulatory perspective, and recognize their role as a potential launch pad for African startups.
And Mark, you've definitely worked with a lot of African regulators, just inherent in your business model. Are they understanding what the future of AI looks like and what it means for inclusion across these different digital services?
I think there's high variability. I mean, this is you as an entrepreneur, you sort of like to think of Africa as one market, but we all know it's 50 plus, 54, depending on how you want to count. And I think, as we heard from the panelists earlier, like scaling across the continent is extremely challenging, and so you have to start realizing that each market requires some planning, some preparation, and some local adaptation. I would say we've had the most hopeful or interesting conversations have tended to be with these, I'll call them quasi-public-private apex-type bodies, either that work in the central bank or similar areas where they see the private sector's importance and they understand how policy ends up impacting private sector. And so they're a little bit more practical in looking for solutions. And so you get away from sort of the theoretical and you get down to the practical, like, okay, if you're going to do this, we need to see a consent layer. And the consent layer has to have, someone's got to click on it, and we need to be able to see that happened. Okay, great. How can we productize that for you in software? Let's have that conversation. Not something about like, well, in page 46 of this 375-page document, you didn't check this box. Like, that's not a very productive conversation.
Right.
So we're seeing more and more of that, and especially, obviously my lens is very narrow. It's the sort of what's going on in digital ID. But there are individual civil servants in some of these organizations who do understand the nuances. They just often are resource constrained. So that is one challenge. I wish many of them could get bigger budgets and that they could do more things. But there are some, I guess, call it bright spots.
Yeah. So another thing that I certainly always hear investors complain about, but entrepreneurs to some degree as well, is the lack of data even available on the African continent. So, I mean, is this a hindrance to really building out some of these problems, or can you use synthetic data to train some of these models? Can you use data from other markets like Stockholm or New York, and will that be applicable in an Africa context? I mean, I'm sure it differs by industry, anything from logistics to identity, but I'm curious Fatima, if you want to take this first.
So I think in terms of usage of data is a very tricky subject of area. So I don't unfortunately have expertise on it, but what I can quickly talk to quickly is what the two gentlemen were speaking on. So we're actually part of a steering committee with the government of Rwanda, specifically the Minister of ICT. So I think around the General Assembly in September, you had Microsoft, NVIDIA, and I think 4 other African countries, and Rwanda was leading it. And the same thing was, how do we go from rhetoric to reality? And the focus was around setting up data centers. So Oracle is actually setting up a data center in 2024 here in Kigali. So it's true, Kigali is a proof of concept. So a lot of people are rushing into this market to do that, but curious to know what Mark has to say in it, since he works with a lot of data. Mark and I have had conversations as well about his work, so
yeah,
I think he would add great input.
I was trying to think about how to tie this back to the conversation we were having in the green room, because that to me was like, it's like where the seats that we each have intersect, and around like getting access to data, being able to use data, and then being able to do the kind of processing. So we do have now data at scale. We've done 75, I think more, 80 million something identity verifications. And so we've also done millions and millions and millions of face verifications and now document verifications. One of the things we have to think about when we operate in Africa is local data protection laws. Because yes, there's GDPR in Europe, but then there's KDPA and NDPR, and there's all these specific data privacy rules in each market. And when we operate in a given market, we have to figure out what we can and can't do with data. And some markets have been much more specific and stringent about those policies, and sometimes we don't really know what the rules are. We need to talk to folks in government to figure them out. And I was saying to Fatima earlier, well, what would be great is if there was just an AWS installation in every African capital, but you've got to have the CUDA servers from NVIDIA, because that's what we need.
Yeah.
Right? And so the challenge then for government is like, how do we figure out a set of policies that are reasonable? Because you can't probably put a data center, at least not yet. I don't know, maybe you guys will get around to that with AWS and Microsoft. But ideally there would be like a handful of places where we can do the kind of intense graphic processing that we need to do, and then stay within the bounds of data protection for the broader African continent.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add to that specifically is, so going back to the, taking an innovative approach to regulations, one of the things that we built into Rwanda's personal data protection and privacy law is a provision for being able to do cross-border data transfers or use a model that's hosted in some server outside Rwanda, use it for activity in Rwanda. Of course, you have to get approval for that from the regulatory body, and the user has to be aware of this. But it's sort of like, looking at the fact that, we just don't have the local capacity to actually be able to run all the different AI models that we need to be able to run. And so as we hopefully work to invest in strong local data and computing infrastructure, like my colleague was talking about, what do we need to do to allow companies to actually be able to take advantage of what's globally available? So I think countries need to take that sort of like innovative approach to this. But beyond that also, I think one of the things that we've noticed is that oftentimes there's a lot of data actually. It might not be in a proper state. You might have to do some cleaning on it. Some of it might be in a physical form, which you can apply some AI technologies to digitize it. The question, and sure, you can always have more and more data, but the question is like, how do you actually demonstrate value out of this data such that whoever is the custodian of that data is comfortable with actually, working with you to figure out what insights you can run from that. And so like leading with value, instead of like leading or give us access to data, leading with, hey, if I get access to these types of data sets, I can create such a tool that can drive so much value for you in these ways. Very specific. I think having those sort of conversations has proven to be quite helpful and impactful in our context at least.
Super interesting. So something that comes up a lot as well, and I think this even came up on the other panel, is one major criticism of AI is the risk of bias and excluding a lot of population discrimination. I'd love to maybe understand, why that could be the case for the African continent and why it's so important to build these local solutions that make sure that we build models that are positive, but also inclusive of the broader population within the continent. A great equalizer.
Yeah. When we started the company 7 years ago, we knew this was an issue within just the very specific world of face recognition. And while things have evolved quite a bit from 7 years ago, when we looked at the data at the time, accuracy of face recognition between, let's say, Eurasian or say Caucasian faces, mostly Eurocentric faces, was higher than it was on darker skinned faces, and in particularly faces of color that were women, people of color that were women. And so we actually went to work on this particular problem. And as we were getting started in the early days, we trained specifically on African face data sets, and then we lined them up against Amazon Recog and a few other open source models. And we were able to actually outperform those other models because we were focused on this population, at least the African population. Over time, there's been a lot of progress, at least in that narrow domain. So a lot of companies have seen this problem, they've addressed it. But I think that's just sort of that's like the tip of the iceberg. You can kind of go down the path of, show me a picture of a doctor, show me a picture of whatever, and you're going to get something that looks like someone who grew up in Los Angeles or Boston that thinks about what that should look like. And that's not necessarily relevant or even accurate, from the perspective of the African continent. And so that it is important that you figure out how to get data that has consent or appropriate data into that training ecosystem. I think one of the things that could be really interesting is if the countries that are at the forefront of this created data sets that were open for people to train on, because that's what some of the other companies did in the early days. Google and Microsoft created these data sets, and they said, hey, developers, go train on this data. You're allowed to do that. And if either African governments or in partnership with the NVIDIAs of the world said, we know it's important to have to remove some bias, but we also know that to do that, you actually need to create training data sets that people can use. That would be like a really practical way to get started, and you could do it for every potential. I mean, at this point, with what's going on in AI, you could do it in every single category or sector.
Yeah, and if I can add just one quick thing, totally agree with representation in the data, and we should definitely do that. But then there's also just like the bias that we have in the world anyway already, right? And so beyond making sure that data sets are representative, there's also the very, very important factor you're alluding to, making sure that Africans, in this particular frame of this conversation, is making sure that Africans are participating in the production of these different tools and products. And I think that's we definitely have to make sure that happens so that you minimize that inherent bias that we have in the world anyway.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, just for context, according to a report by AI Expo, which was released last year, there are 2,400 AI organizations on the continent. So work is being done within the region. And I also think is the biggest opportunities to be participants, because chatbot can only output what was inputted into it. So, I think we can go into large language models later, but there are some references that just go to show how open source information is being used to address biases and capture nuances.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's jump right into that, actually. You've done a lot of work in natural language processing. So naturally, I have to ask, on a continent where there's anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 languages. How does that work in an African context? I see on one hand, AI and natural language processing could certainly solve big problems, even for the illiterate, and certainly bringing these fragmented countries together. But on the other hand, it seems like almost an insurmountable challenge to get all those people into the ecosystem and all those languages as well.
So I'll start with the blockers, and then I can share a couple of wins. I think one of the blockers is because you have so many languages, and a lot of them aren't written languages. They tend to be oral. Capturing them can be a bit tricky. In terms of a win, there is a NVIDIA partner called Jacaranda Health. So they're based in Kenya, just around the corner. They raised $10.4 million. And on October 23rd of this year, they released a large language model in Swahili, and it's open sourced. So it's a huge deal. Typically, when AI startups come with breakthrough, they're quite humble and quiet about it. If it was a fintech startup, it would be a whole different shebang, but it's a huge deal because prior to that, you had Llama by Meta, you had Mozilla, and you had Google, who had models in Swahili. But like Mark was saying, if you can't understand what it means to take a photo of a passport, it misses a certain nuance. And what they did was they were able to get data from Swahili speakers. And Swahili is quite important because 200 million people speak it across Central Africa and also Eastern Africa. So that's just an example of change that's happening, and it was very recent. Additionally to that, you have a community called Indaba. They have 32 chapters across the continent, from Mali to Sudan to Burkina to South Africa, and they have active developer communities who are working on these issues. So yeah, I think the last thing I'll also say is I think University of Wits as well, when it comes to a lot of AI research, it came out of there as well. So there just isn't a lot of visibility when it comes to AI. People always think that it happens overnight, but OpenAI have been silently working on GPT-3 since 2015. So I think what would be interesting is to have this conversation again in 3 to 5 years and see what has changed, because just because we're not seeing it doesn't mean it isn't happening, right? Because we all woke up when ChatGPT happened and everyone's like, where did that come from? But for those in the industry, it wasn't necessarily, it was still shocking, but there was a paper that Google released in 2014, 15.
We knew it was coming.
Yeah, exactly.
It almost, I was going to say, it almost kind of, it's an inverse of what's going on with the funding environment and the macroeconomic environment. So there's such pressure right now on companies to get to profitability, prove your economics, like have a very clear value proposition immediately and make money. And I understand that. But I think this is an area, if you really want to seed innovation around this area, you're going to have to figure out how to support and finance, and in some cases, leave alone some smaller teams that are going to work in these areas.
Yeah.
It's just still useful to talk about practical applications, but sometimes these things take years to sort of foment. And it was one of my machine learning engineers told me, like, the difference between computer vision or machine learning and traditional software is if you put 10 hours of work into a mobile app, you're going to get 10 hours of mobile app. You put 10 hours of work into a large language model, you don't know what you're going to get, or you're not sure what you're going to get. And it's the 11th hour that all of a sudden you get something. So.
Yeah. So my last question, since we're running out of time, is I'd love to ask you each individually, what is a major problem that AI cannot yet fix that you would hope that it someday can? And do you think that that's achievable in our lifetime, or is it just science fiction?
I don't know.
I can start. I was going to leave mine to last. I don't know if any of you have seen in Foundation, but there's a little box that they tap, and it does all of the math to kind of tell you what the future looks like. I would love to have that for my investment decisions. My IC is great, but that would be even better.
So you said something about science fiction. So at NVIDIA, we have something where we say we turn science fiction into reality. And speaking about biases, when it comes to healthcare, sickle cell, triple breast cancer, it affects Black and brown people more. So I would be curious to see how that is going to be addressed. And there is a startup that's working on it called Yamachi, based in Africa, raised 3 million, based in Ghana specifically, and they're doing a lab. So they're still in the early days. So I'll give you an update in 5 years.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
I think I would, our applications of this technology are highly tied to financial services and transactions. And I would love to see a world where transaction fraud is like something we talk about in a history book, and it just doesn't really happen that often. And I think there are parts of the global economy now, at least within, let's say, the card networks in the US, where fraud at like the transaction level card fraud is like increasingly rare within parts of the US economy or European economy, but it's still rampant in other markets. And even transaction fraud and now all these new forms between banks and mobile apps and crypto, it's still huge. And I think I would love us to be having this conversation in, I don't know, 5 years and say, wow, that's a solved problem. Let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah, definitely.
I think mine would be around what you were just describing, which is like the ability to be able to learn about things that, in a way that we have been able to learn about before. And particularly problems that are unique to Africa that, the world just hasn't been able to, or had the, sort of like the interest, maybe, I don't know what the word is, to actually solve. And so it could be, helping us figure out drugs that address the tropical or neglected tropical diseases that we have here that you don't have in other parts. Or it could be around, studying about what my grandma was mixing up when she was giving me these medicines to do different things. And so I think the ability to be able to learn about things in a way that we have been able to learn about and focus that on African-specific problems and having Africans participate in that activity, I think is quite exciting.
Amazing. Well, I can't wait to talk to you guys in 5 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lexi.